Okay, I think we'll get started now. Welcome, everybody. It's delighted to see so many names that I know and some names that I don't know. I'm Joshua Shanes. I'm the director of the Arnold Center for Israel Studies here at the College of Charleston. It is my delight to welcome our guest tonight, Manekin, who'll be speaking about his book and other insights he has about the situation in Israel. Um, I just want to begin by saying uh, a little bit of our hearts are with everyone who is now living in the land, and we hope and pray for their safety and for peace to come very, very, very soon, immediately. Let me please introduce our guest, and then I will give him the floor. Michal Manekin is an Israeli activist against Israel's occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. He was the executive director of Breaking the Silence, a veterans organization, and of Molad, the Center for the Renewal of Israeli Democracy. He is a founder and director of the Alliance Fellowship, a Jewish-Palestinian political leadership network, and a founding leader of the Faithful Left, a movement of religious Jews fighting oppression and inequality. And I'm reading now his biography. He's currently, by the way, a fellow at the Harvard Divinity School at the Center for Religion and Public Life. And I'm reading from the back of his new book that we'll be discussing today. It's called End of Days. And in fact, I'm going to go ahead and post the title and the link in the chat box. The chat box, by the way, is open. It's open to everyone in the audience. We're going to use it for audience questions. Most people prefer to type their questions rather than put on their video. So please, if you don't mind, try to keep it for that purpose. I would hate for an important question to get buried because of a side conversation. So we'll use the chat box for questions, with which Mikhail and myself will monitor. Please do feel free to start typing those questions as soon as they pop in your head, and we'll be sure to start addressing them about halfway through the hour. Now, I'm reading from the back of Mikhail's important new book, title, as you see in the chat box, End of Days, Ethics, Tradition, and Power in Israel. I'm going to read to you a little bit from the back and then have Michal tell us about his work. End of Days is both a meditation on Jewish morality in the age of Israeli Jewish power and a cri de coeur by an Orthodox Israeli Jew, a former combat officer in the IDF, for Israelis to look into the Jewish religious ethical tradition for an alternative to the secular and religious Zionism that sanctifies power, statehood, and sovereignty. Appealing to a wealth of Jewish sources from the Bible to the present, including medieval Jewish ethical literature, rabbinic sources, Jewish law, and contemporary Israeli thought, the book presents an argument against the occupation of the Palestinians and the suppression of their rights from the perspective of a modern Israeli religious Jew. Michal, thank you so much for joining us. And for those who don't know you and have not read the book, which I'm guessing is most people, can you tell us a little bit about your background, how you grew up, the community you currently live in Israel, and how you came to write this book and do this work?
Sure. I mean, first of all, thanks so much for hosting this. It's a real pleasure and privilege. So the book, I will say, first of all, is a translation of the book in Hebrew, which came out roughly 2 years ago. But in a way is in dialogue with what's happening now, and definitely in the last year, very much. In terms of my personal background, I would say I was raised in a Orthodox home. My mother comes from a Haredi background, Israeli, and my dad's an American. He comes from so grew up conservative, Baal Tshuva, into Orthodoxy as an adult. So I was raised in a very Orthodox home, I think one which would consider itself very committed halachically, and also very committed ethically to issues of equality. So in that sense, the book is really a continuation of my education and doesn't have there's no rebellious there's no rebellious notion, I think, in the book. Maybe a bit, but not too much. I grew up, I would say, on the fringes of religious Zionist institutions, and here that's something which I found. I'm in the U.S. now for the year, and I found that something which is more important to articulate here is that in Israel, you really need to choose what category of religion you are in a much more I would say, comprehensive way than maybe you do in the US because there are different education systems. So I was raised in the religious Zionist education system, and I raised my children in the religious Zionist education system. So in that sense, it is, of the four Israeli education systems, it's the one that is closest to me. I went to yeshiva for a couple of years in Ma'ale Gilboa, and was in the army for 4 years, primarily in the Second Intifada, in the infantry in a unit called Golani. Since I was discharged, I've been very fortunate to be in activism for the last 2 decades in various different efforts, which you mentioned before, that are written in the back of the book. I would say for me, the context of this book is written up until recently, in the last couple of years, my sort of religious thought, to the extent that there was religious thought, was really separate from my political work, in the sense that politics was politics and religion was religion, and they were split from each other, at least publicly. I think in recent years, for me, there's increasing fear, frustration, in terms of what's happening in terms of religious discourse in Israel, but not only, regarding questions of nationalism, of ethics. I would also say just of morality in general, and how one deals with people who are weaker than him, be they Jewish or not, how one deals with weakness in general, questions of compassion versus revenge, that sort of thing. And I felt that there is too little writing and thought being given to the current moment in which we are, as religious Jews from an ethical perspective. So I remember growing up, in the 80s and 90s, there were all sorts of figures who focused on contradicting or counter ethical perspectives from religious Zionism, and for a lot of reasons, those kind of disappeared. And I felt increasingly the need to explain myself, both to religious Zionists, but also to people on the left who don't necessarily understand that perspective. So that's where the book came from. And in many senses, it's very personal and internal, in trying to explain both the historical tradition of what happened to religious Jewry, and perhaps an attempt at a beginning of an attempt to start articulating a counter view in an Israeli context. So maybe I would say that sort of the primary question of the book, which I'm concerned, is not how one creates an ethical Jewish state. I don't have much to say on that issue, and if I do, I think it's relatively for me, trivial. The question which interests me more is how a Jew should behave within any state, and alachat kama v'kama, like primarily in a state where one is of great privilege. So in my context, it's Israel, but I imagine it's a question that American Jews can ask themselves as well. And how does one access our ethical tradition, which was primarily written from a perspective of from the margins? How does one access it? Can one, and how does one access that tradition from a place of citizenship, or or being at the center? So maybe that's a bit of an overview, perhaps dry, but
No,
that's where I'm coming from.
That's very, very helpful. Thank you. And then for those who just came in a few minutes late, the chat box is open. So everyone's encouraged, if you have questions for our guest, to go ahead and type them in the chat box. We're not going to quite get to them yet, but I'm keeping my eye on them, and we'll surely get to as many of them as we can in the second half of the hour. So if I may ask, I'm going to quote, the president was caught on a hot mic this week, so I'm going to be funny and say, can you talk about your come to Jesus moment?
Yeah.
And if I can be clever from it, and what exactly, what happened? You remain, you're an Israeli, you are a religious Zionist, remain in that world, very much committed to it, as I understand from the book. So, what exactly happened that brought you to want to address your own community, and how exactly? We can't give a whole history of religious Zionism here in 30 minutes. But can you give an overview of, what you see religious Zionism having its relationship to traditional Judaism, and what you want to see, what you want to recover, what you're trying to get at, what you're hoping to accomplish.
So if I understand, you're sort of referring to the beginning of the book. I will say, as a sort of as a former director of Breaking the Silence, um, I, I'm sort of conscious of epiphany. Epiphany is usually sort of more of a didactic tool. So in that context, it's important for me to frame that story. I start the book um, with a story from my service, which I actually didn't tell Breaking the Silence because I didn't think it merited a testimony, and it's definitely in terms of issues pertaining to human rights, definitely in the context of what we've been seeing since the 7th of October, not anything too grand. But I do describe a moment in which, I mean, the backstory is that we were sitting in the nebulous area, and we were controlling a road which is meant to lead to a settlement, and we took over a house, which is common practice, a Palestinian house, and because the Palestinians were sort of unseen to us, it, I ended up going to pee, um, going outside to the bathroom, and at a certain point, while in the midst of my action, some meters ahead of me, I saw that the owner of the house, I think, or one of the people of the owners of the house was really staring at me, and my nakedness, so to speak, and what I write in the book is that I was wearing a helmet, so the kippah was invisible to her, but it was definitely visible for me, and it was a moment where I really felt that there is something of my education of how a Jew should behave, for lack of a better word, which was completely lost to me, what one would call Chilul Hashem. And I mean, since that moment, there have been many other moments, and I imagine before that moment there were other moments. But the question is of how does one work to try to salvage one's ethical upbringing has become sort of something that I'm seriously interested in. The book itself is a lot of the sources it's sort of appealing to is what's called Musar literature. I mean, it's in modernity it's called Musar literature, but it's really sort of like virtue ethical literature of how which Jewish tradition has a vast number of these books of, which are basically these training manuals of how does one sort of better themselves ethically. And as somebody who's in activism, it's something that we don't think about a lot is that, if you want to know world politics, you need to study. And if you want to be healthy, you need to, eat right or exercise. But the idea of sort of training yourself on being good is one which we don't really think of. So really the attempt is to try to assess what are sort of constant virtues which tradition is talking about, and again, what happened to them? What happened to all of these traditions? What happened to the fact that if we imagine our great grandparents, we imagine a very specific type of Jewish individual, but if we imagine a modern representative of religion, we imagine probably even a counter model. Of that same ethic. So what happened, I think, is also really important for me to understand, because a lot of times today, even when I'm trying to explain, to my kids about our tradition, it seems to them almost bizarre, because what they're understanding Jewry is, definitely from a religious perspective, and what they're getting from everywhere else is something which is very, very different. So I actually think there's quite a bit of work to be done there. And some of that is on the nationalism stuff, but some of that is also just on our approaches to power, our approaches to the powerless, And here, maybe I'll also say that it's important for me to engage with our tradition seriously, including, a great deal of sources that we have, which are perhaps more challenging. And I think it's important to engage with those as well. How do we engage with, um, you know, um, those vast traditions that we have, which are hostile to non-Jews? So how does one engage with those seriously, I think is an important question as well.
So let me ask, in general, I'm waiting until the second half of the hour to read the questions, but Robert Rosen, who I know is a prominent lawyer here in Charleston, asked a question which I think actually is a nice segue. He asks, do you believe Zionism is a part of or is supported by the Jewish religion? And I feel like what you're getting at is, and I read the book carefully many times, and it seemed to me what you are arguing, Michal, is that that religious Zionism as it currently exists is drawing on aspects of Jewish religion, but doing it in certain ways that are very myopic, and that there are vast troves of Judaism that it is suppressing in that process to bad ends. Am I reading you correctly? And if so, can you we've been sort of dancing around it, go into some specifics. What exactly is religious Zionism, advocating now specifically, both theologically and in practice? And what specifically are the traditions that you think are, Ikarim, that are main parts of Judaism that are being ignored or suppressed? So the
Okay, I'll
first
give
part
it
is,
my
am I
best
reading you
shot.
correctly? And then
Yeah,
the second part is,
it's actually a bit sort of tricky to translate this, I feel. This is one of the conversations which is tricky to translate outside of the country. And I will say that I was a bit hesitant in translating this book to English, partially for this reason. And Professor Shol Magid, who was super helpful, also sort of moved me into translating and also wrote, I mean, I think a beautiful forward. So the book, part of the reason I'm reluctant is precisely because of the question. And I will say before this isn't a cop-out answer, but before that, the only sentence I added in English to the book is this book is not about Zionism. It's not a Zionist book. It's not a post-Zionist book. It's not an anti-Zionist book. And in many ways, that's not really a conversation in Israel. Are you a Zionist? Are you a non-Zionist? Are you a post-Zionist? It's not a conversation that I've really had in Israel in recent years, and it's been every conversation on the book in the U.S., which I find fascinating. Regardless, and it's very hard for me to talk about Zionism only as an ideology and not as a lived experience because, and now getting into the question, for what it's worth. First, we need to, I think, identify the roots of Zionism as heretical roots, not because this is some sort of odd interpretation of Zionism. Pretty much all of the articulators of Zionism saw Zionism as not only a godless project, meaning a project which puts not God as sovereign, but the people as sovereign, but we're very explicit about moving it from God to the people, and we're even more explicit about the fact that religion is the source, the faith is the source of our problem. So if Jews said we are in exile because of our sins and our end of days, so to speak, will be when God sort of reappears due to our repentance. Zionism said, this is exactly the reason we're stuck in poverty, this kind of passive sinking. And Zionism tried to create an active community and in an active political community. And in that sense, uh, the book, or for myself, the book is a counter argument against Zionist theology, and within that, religious Zionist theology. And so, if one reads it from that perspective, the book is not a Zionist book at all. That being said, to make things perhaps more complicated, I live in Israel. It's my home. I'm thankful for a lot of what it gave me and it gave my children. On the national side, it provided security for my grandparents, and there's quite a bit in the book about that. On the cultural side, I love my children in Hebrew, and that's not something that I want to sweep aside as something which is not. So it's very much ingrained in who I am as an individual, and I think one needs to be thankful for what things are what society gives you, even if you have great frustrations with parts of that ideology. So in a sense, there is a contradiction, which I'm very aware of in the book, in terms of me seeing the theology of Zionism, and a lot of times how it's articulated, not only in practice, but also in theory, on the day-to-day. And on the other hand, a great respect for the political program that Zionism so the Zionists offered to my family and to my community. And the way I'm trying to deal with that on a personal level is to try to perhaps thicken the individual and communal element so as to create a counterbalance on the national. And what I mean by that is that I think for a very long time, the only way that Jewish politics were discussed in Israel is through the lens of the state. What makes the state Jewish? What makes the state not Jewish? And I think that conversation is very limited because ultimately nation states are, you know, projects of the current era, which might not exist in 100 years. We have no idea, in every type of political structure which existed over the last 2,000 years, there were Jews who explained why this particular structure is significant, like Abarbanel thought that about kings. So, but maybe in 200 years ago, it's not that Israel will be demised, just there'll be some other idea of how communities organize themselves politically. And I think the more important question for me is how do we keep on spiritual and ethical and halachic traditions in the context of state power. So I don't know if that makes me a Zionist or a non-Zionist. I think it really depends on who one asks. And in that sense, I think that's, it's an interesting, I guess, sort of benchmark for something, but it's not necessarily something that I have um, much to add on. If somebody says, Zionism, as many people do now around the world, Zionism is inherent to Zionism is the idea of ethnic supremacy. So I will say I'm against ethnic supremacy. So that means I'm not a Zionist. And if somebody says, Zionism is something different, so maybe I'll agree with that. Regarding religious Zionism, what I am regarding your question, what I feel more comfortable with in versions of what one could call religious Zionism, which existed at a certain period, is ambivalence. There's very little ambivalence today regarding religious Zionism, but there were very ambivalent religious thinkers in the past, anywhere from people like in some cases Soloveitchik, to some cases Rav Ovadia Yosef, to Rhinus to an extent, depending on what writing. Even people on the more radical side, like Rabbi Binyamin, who saw himself, who was a binationalist and talked and wrote about the Nakba in real time and wrote about the importance of returning the refugees and didn't see that there needed to be ownership of lands in general, and had a very sort of sophisticated understanding of relationships between Jews and Muslims. And while he was doing that, he built, he was the first publisher of the Tzofeh magazine, which up until 20 years ago was the religious Zionist magazine. So I think when you sort of scratch the surface a bit, things become more complicated. I will say, just to not cop out completely, to the extent that Zionism is about ownership and marginalization of the other, I am opposed to that political goal. So on a personal level and political level, if it is important for me that the home of Jews in Israel does not come at the expense of the home of Palestinians, and that doesn't only mean equal citizenship, that means equal ownership, including immigration. So I don't understand how Jews can talk about the desire of return, but not allow the return of others. And maybe lastly, I don't think Jewish majoritarianism is that important. It's not, at least not for me. I want Jews to be able to organize politically in a context where peoples or nations are allowed to organize politically. I don't understand why Jews specifically are not allowed to. But it's not important for me that they're a majority in the land. So that's in terms of sort of, you know, just to get into the concrete
Yeah,
stuff and not
thank
to
you.
say things,
So,
up in the air.
in a minute, I'm going to ask you about what the meaning of what you've seen since October 7th and the war in Gaza, what you're seeing in the West Bank since October 7th as well, since that's your forte really. But before I do, I do want to bring in one question because I think it's relevant. And again, I know I announced at the beginning I'm going to save your questions in the chat to the end, and yet I keep going to them. So please keep typing, typing your questions. I'll try to get to them. Nancy Kaplan asks about conflating religious Zionism with with the current party that calls itself Religious Zionism, which is led by Smotrich and Ben Gvir, right? And she says, is it right to conflate them? And I'm thinking also, I'm looking at your book. In the middle of the book, you talk about the range of ideas outside of this issue that religious Zionism tolerates, right? You could be more conservative or more liberal when it comes to women, row in the synagogue. You could be more conservative, more liberal about gays. You could be more about biblical criticism. All sorts of areas. There's toleration and space, and you're still in the tribe of religious Zionism. But you're right. There was one. I'm quoting you now. There was one area where uniformity of opinion still reigns and minimal discussion space is still the norm. The question of the meaning, religious centrality, and political implications of Israeli nationalism, right? There are hardly any religious voices today challenging the idea that Jewish citizens matter more than Arab citizens, that oppose the occupation, or that, that basically, and I think you use the word Jewish supremacy in the book. So are you arguing that essentially, although there were these older voices, you want to uncover that today there's that Smotrich and Ben Gvir sort of do represent religious Zionism? Is that
Well, first I would say that the older voices that I'm trying to uncover, some of them are Zionists and some of them are not. So it's also like, and also the sources that I quote in the book. I mean, like Yitzhak Breuer, I don't think saw himself as a Zionist, and
no, did not.
but I think he's a really important source, and definitely people like Rav Aaron Shmuel Tamaris and people who are a bit older than the project. Well, I mean, Tamaris was around long enough to be very frustrated with Zionism and had to break with it, and I really try to view things through the lens of sort of like the Torah that interests me, and not through. This isn't the book is not a project of romanticizing that past. I mean, if it's romanticizing any past, it's not that one. But that doesn't mean. But it's not a negation of it either. So I think there are some religious Zionist thinkers which I really like a lot of their writing, and there are some which I less identify with, and I think that's fine. I really don't want to use sort of like the limits of it's also on a personal level. I didn't really grow up like like as a like religious Zionist. It's not my dad's upbringing, it's not my mom's upbringing. Like Rav Kook was never really in our household, and neither was like Soloveitchik. So it's not something that so even if I was in sort of in those institutions, I was never really it's what's important for me is like the relevant for me the Torah that I think is most relevant for me to access. I don't know where Rav Moshe Feinstein stood on a lot of these issues, but I think he has some really important tshuvot on war, which need to be discussed today. So, and if he was a Zionist or a non-Zionist, it's sort of less relevant for me. And also those words mean very different things in very different decades. I'm cautious of the word hijacking in regard to Smotrich, because there is a sort of a point that I'm making in the book, not that history had to move in the way it did, but I think the structure of viewing, and that's sort of one of the central themes in the book, is that the structure of viewing Israel as at the beginning of redemption is like a lot of projects in Jewish history which viewed their time as a redemption, these projects tend to lead to political and ethical failure. So in many senses, I think Smotrich is a true continuer of religious Zionism in the sense that he is what happens to generation after generation, which view Israel as an extraordinary project, which is defined by extraordinary rules and primarily allows you to do things which other states are not allowed to do. And I think that in that context, that's very much in light of both religious and secular Zionist approach to theology. Um, so in that sense, while obviously one can trace a sort of a project in which, religious Zionists, were basically together with the Labor Party till 1977. And then, something that can't be imagined. In like 94, I think Aleph Orbach was like the Mafdal's, sorry, this is inside baseball, but Aleph Orbach, really important scholar, also talked about the importance of returning the occupied territories in like 1968. And he was the nominee for president by the Religious Zionist Party in 1974, something that we can't imagine happening today. I mean, we can't even imagine Bennett leading religious Zionism. So in that sense, obviously there's something happening here, and I don't like when people say it needed to go that way. But so it didn't need to go that way, but I think it is important to ask why it did.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, the reason it did is because of the theological attempt to explain Israel as the end of exile. And for me, and here I think also Shaul Magi does really important work in his latest book. For me, the state of Israel is not the beginning of the redemption. The beginning of the redemption is Kalu Kol HaKitzim. The beginning of to the extent that one can say something about the beginning of redemption, it's right after the Second Temple is destroyed. That's the beginning of redemption. But there is no moment in history which can, or even a political moment which can or should be defined as something which is theologically different. And viewing Israel in that redemptive lens, and oh, hey, you're here. And viewing Israel through that redemptive lens, be it secular Zionism or religious Zionism, I think is a real significant problem.
Right. In other words, it's important to remember we live in an unredeemed world, because if you're living in the beginning of a redemption as a different moment, then it enables other kinds of behaviors which are not good. So
Yeah.
you talking about other sources. I remember one point you talk about the Chafetz Chaim. For those who don't know, the Chafetz Chaim is the most, I mean, like a founder of Orthodox Judaism almost. I mean, he certainly one of the most universally, ubiquitously venerated fathers of Orthodoxy. The Mishnah Brura, his compendium on Jewish law, is the source of Jewish law for almost all Orthodox Jews. And yet one of the few books of his that was not often reprinted, if at all, is his book on war, which is very, negative about war and very concerned about war. It's not exactly pacifist, but it doesn't like it. And that one doesn't get studied. But the religious Zionist texts that do get studied are not just positive about war, but they're arguing, because they posit, and this is, if I'm reading you correctly, correct me if I'm wrong, because they posit that the state has, this is from Tzvi Yehuda Kook, has the status of a Jewish king. Therefore, the war is an obligatory war. Therefore, they justifies collateral, killing civilians without any moral problem, because it's an obligatory war led by a Jewish king, which is the state of Israel. And this is something, it seemed to me that you were trying to recover traditions that say, wait a minute, we don't have to be pacifist to not have this view that.
Yeah. I would say mainly it's a question of what are the ethical perspectives that interest you, and people like the Chafetz Chaim, are viewing really war as a necessary part of a very dangerous and perhaps um, negative present, which you need to participate in. So what they're asking is really, how does a Jewish soldier behave in that context, and how does he protect himself? And it's really, you see it, by the way, even how the book is structured. There's like there after how you need to be like a good friend, and how you keep Shabbat and all that stuff, and how you get out of the army as much as possible to go home. Um, there is a prayer for entry into battle. And the text right after that is Dinei Kvura, is how one should run burials. And that's not a nationalist way
Yeah.
of editing these types of books. And come along religious Zionists and say, no, we're interested in the question. And this is why it's important to me to focus on the individual and the community and on the state, because come across religious Zionism and say, let's not focus from the perspective of the soldier, let's focus on morality from the perspective of the state. And in many books, religious Zionist books, the soldier is basically told to try to, and I quote some of this in my book, is basically to crush his own understanding of reality in order to allow for a greater understanding, which is a military's understanding. And I will say, and I don't write about this in the book, but the Chafetz Chaim book was actually translated into English.
Really? I
Yeah,
didn't know that.
around World War I think, and also severely edited and turned into a book which is much more pro-war and nationalist than he would have he would have intended. So a lot of the halacha is the same, but the perspective becomes the perspective of the state, and that is what worries and frustrates me, which is how the individual disappears and is basically taught to not see. And I think around what's happening now in Gaza, there's a lot of that happening, and you know, when one jumps into this conversation, one I think should justly and rightly say that the context is in Gaza, I think is complicated because of the 7th of October. And while I'm of the notion, I think as many people are, that 7th of October happened in a political context, it still happened and still requires a response, violent response. That being said, the religious Zionist push in Israel to view any empathy as weakness is, I think, a grave moral threat. And, Smotrich was talking about that today. It's like the only quote they quote from Chazal is "Merachem al achzarim, safo leitachzer lachmanim." If you're compassionate to the cruel, you end up being cruel to the compassionate, or something of that nature. It's like the only thing. So there's no talk about compassion. There's no talk about empathy. There's no talk about seeing, and seeing the other, in this case, the Palestinians, but not only. It could also be seeing our own refugees in the country who are, outside our home, or seeing the hostages, which has been sort of like, now there's a big fight of religious Zionists against, like the religious Zionist institution, against any hostage deal. And a lot of the terminology around that views caring for the hostages as a type of weakness, which should be secondary to winning, which I find is very foreign to the Jewish tradition that I was raised in. So it's not just a matter. It's not pacifism versus non-pacifism. It's deep skepticism towards violence, and state violence in particular, as opposed to sort of throwing your lot in ethically and religiously with state power.
Yeah, which is a great transition, because we need to be talking. I'm cognizant of the time. By the way, for those listening, officially the event is 1 hour, but Michal has generously agreed to stay a few extra minutes. We can go next to 10 or 20 minutes if necessary. So please, so that'll be available, and I'm continuing to monitor the chat. Please keep your questions coming. I was really struck in the book by some of the material you bring towards your argument that religious Zionism has become too sort of self-referential, celebrating itself over, and basically cutting out God. I mean, it's really, in some places, it felt to me like a call to remember, almost, I mean, you cite Leibovich, although you disagree with him in many ways, but almost a reminder that there is some sort of worship of something bigger than ourselves, and it shouldn't be about ourselves. I mean, some of the quotes you bring So, for example, the celebration of power on the Temple Mount, right? That it's about asserting our authority, having our power, not the holiness of the place, but our power over the place. Or the text that that someone wrote, hero, and this was just, for me as a teacher, I'm like, oh my God, this is gold. But it's also as a human being and as a Jew, it was quite disturbing. Hero Israel, the kotel is our kotel. The kotel is one, right?
Right.
Taking the Shema Yisrael, the basic mantra of Judaism. Hero Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Hero Israel, the kotel is our kotel. The kotel is one. Uh, and this seems to be what you're just describing in terms of your concerns about the way the war is being waged and the way
Yeah.
with Zionism, that this is an extension of that, and almost to be expected, tragically.
Yeah, and I would also sort of place within that religious Zionist leadership are the art. I think there's what makes them so powerful today as a political elite in Israel is that they are the articulators of this identity, this Israeli identity, but they are not the sole holders of this um, identity in that they are the articulators of this identity for a lot of non-religious leaders as well. Netanyahu is not he doesn't focus, he doesn't do like 3 times a day davening for what I know. He doesn't eat kosher. That we do know. He doesn't keep Shabbat. But so it's not that Netanyahu is a religious Zionist. I mean, he's ultimately responsible for this war. But I think those who are articulating the state ethos and ideology are religious Zionists. And what I try to show in my book is that it's a bit of a circle in that this idea of here, for example, this idea of hero Israel, the kotel is whatever, is one. It actually stems from pre-Israel, very non-religious secular thinker, Itamar Ben-Avi, and it sort of finds its way to religious Zionism. So religious Zionism is really being secularized, while the state is in a way becomes more religious. So it's sort of this
Wow.
weird circle happening in the articulation of what state identity is, and that's where, and I saw this came up in the chat. I think that's why people like Tamaris are so powerful, because they're for like us today as students, because they're really I think advanced in articulating the dangers of that type of in that type of thinking in various different contexts. And in the Tamaris instance, it ended up in great tragedy. If you read his later works, which are coming out in recent years, and I think some are supposed to come out, I hope, soon. It ends up being a very frustrating understanding of the human condition and of the Jewish condition, but
Yeah,
I think
indeed.
important nonetheless.
So the percentage of religious Zionists is relatively small. So can you speak about the value of this? Is this an internal book only? You are a religious Zionist living in Israel, and you've worked for 20 years to end the occupation of the West Bank, and in Gaza, and Gaza. I'll just leave it at that. And how your book is sort of a religious call. You even use the French, like cri de cœur, which I understand means a scream from the heart. I
Yeah.
speak 5 languages, and French is not one of them. So you're screaming from the heart to your community to which you're committed. Is it also speaking beyond that? I'm guessing a lot of our listeners and a lot of your readers. And by the way, for those who are late, the link to the book is the very beginning of the chat. It's there for you. Um, is it speaking beyond the religious Zionist world? Does it have what to? Is it important? Is this important
Yeah.
beyond the Zionist world?
Um, Look, I'm definitely writing for people who language of Torah is important and significant for them. A lot of those people, it's unsurprisingly, I think a lot of people in sort of the Orthodox tradition that I'm part of sort of relate to that. And it's also, it's been around 200 years of different streams of Judaism, and I grew up in a specific stream. And that language is more comfortable for me. And there's a lot of, Haredi thinkers in the 20th century in the book, but there aren't any Reform thinkers in the book, not as judgment, but just it's just not what I know. And it's not what sounds like home to me. And so I'm not trying to reform religious Zionism. I think so long as that there is an occupation, it makes tragically it makes sense that so long as that there's occupation, most Israelis will support it. And Because the position of not wanting to have what's yours tends to be a minority position on any power related issue, and it makes sense to me that religious Zionists will hyper support the occupation. And I am aware that I'm creating a uh, counter model, but that counter model is not only for or even maybe not primarily for religious Zionism, but there are most Israelis are traditional to some extent. Most Israelis have some sort of relationship with their ancestry and background. And I think so long as Judaism is perceived for them as the rationale for supremacy, it basically forces them to choose between not relating to the Jewish tradition or not wanting equality. And I think most people would choose the latter and not the former. So I think it's really important, definitely as religious Zionism becomes pretty much the only dominant ideology in Israel, it's important to create a counter conversation, um, which is uh, which is also based on text. That's not to mean you can't come to my conclusions not based on text, but I think it's important for a lot of people to base them on text. And I'm also just be sort of like from for a second. I think that's how Hashem wants us to think and write. Regarding the American context, so I will say, or any sort of a context, I will purposely not use the word diasporic, but as any context of Israelis,
Yeah, you responding to I should say you're responding to a question, I think, right now when you're about to speak, which is, and I'll read the question out for those who missed it. What are your perspectives on diasporism, right? For those who live in Israel or outside of Israel. I think it's
um, so I find interesting the difference between diasporism and exile. I feel more understanding of the word exile than I do diasporism. The idea that um, one should be happy about not living in Israel is or that is sort of new home is something which is foreign to me. And I think it's hard to find that kind of articulation in tradition. I also find that diasporism, that language of diasporism as like articulated by like Butler to some extent and by Boyarin, is like a very American progressive project, which I just don't really understand culturally. And one which I think is very much focused on integrating into America. It's not an issue of foreignness, it's one of negation. And in that sense, it strikes me even almost as sort of like a negative mirror to religious Zionism. But
Mm.
for me, I feel much more, I'll purposely say, at home with the idea of homelessness as articulated by people like, like even in the Middle Ages, by people like the Shla or by Arame. The idea that wherever you go, you need to feel a bit foreign and not, you need to integrate through fights for justice. So I don't understand the notion of diaspora, um, or at least I don't identify with it as a positive project. And it seems to me basically trying to create just an inverse version of Zionism. And what I'm interested in is asking how one can live, let's call it as an exilic Jew, in both Israel um, um, or the U.S. or anywhere else. And I think there's a lot of I mentioned Shaul before, but definitely like Amnon Raz Karkotskin, his book on Sfat recently. It's going to come out in English. I'm purposely saying it now. I think it's supposed to come out in English next year. But looking at models of how Jews are articulated living in places and living outside of places is much more a language which I feel comfortable or identification with than sort of than like the Bayaran-esque like language of diaspora through fights for justice, through like American progressive fights for justice. It's just something that I just don't really understand. I mean, I can be for the American progressive fights for justice. I just don't understand sort of like the
Theologically, you want to, it's not that you want to emphasize diaspora, so you want to bring exile back to Israel, which is Shaul's project as well, right? To bring in,
yeah, and I think
we are in exile, and that exile brings a certain, I don't know, epistemological humility, and a sense that humility allows us to behave in a more ethical manner. Is that what you're getting at?
Yes, but it also creates a different definitely for an Israeli it creates a different idea of the question of ownership. Ownership becomes less important than dwelling in. There definitely I definitely understand Israel. There was a question before about praying for the rebuilding of Jerusalem. So I pray for that 3 times a day, but I don't imagine like talpiot when I imagined the rebuilding of Jerusalem. My dad says always that like if you were praying politically, you would actually pray to stop all the building in Jerusalem. And he says that as Jerusalem, like there's too much building. But but in seriousness, I don't understand how one like can say our prayer the way we say our prayer if we view Israel as a redemptive project. It makes sense to me that the rebuilding of Zion that we're talking about is one which is in which God is present in. And here, I've been saying this a bunch recently, that if you ask Jews like to imagine God's hand, everybody will tell you that's insane. You can't imagine sort of the unimaginable. But if you ask, Jews to imagine the end of exile and the beginning of redemption, they'll say, oh, like, parliamentary democracy in the mid 20th, 21st century, run by, a system of checks and balances to some extent. And um and uh that sounds to me just as crazy as imagining God's hand. Sort of turning that into a political reality. Yeah.
You know, one could read your book from a perspective and be depressed to a certain extent. I mean, you describe a reality. You describe some of the reality in the West Bank, which is just in many ways terrible. The kind of and it's gotten, as I understand, much worse since October 7th. The amount of violence against Palestinians and a sort of cleansing, as it were, of people pushing Palestinians off land and so on. You could be very depressed, but one could also have an optimistic view, which is I'm going to play off what you just said a little while ago, which is to say, if Israel is largely traditional, right, even though it's a largely secular society, but religious Zionism is the only real that game in town to a certain extent, and the other traditional Jews, as you put it, if they have to choose between equality and what they view as the traditional view of Jewish supremacy, they're going to go with that
Yeah.
because they want to connect to Jewish tradition. So what you're really doing, it seems to me, is not just trying to put your own narrow little sector of Israel on a course correction. What you're really doing is saying our tradition holds the potential to be not not the Ben-Gvirs. We could be the Magnuses. In other words, religious tradition could allow us to create an equal society grounded in Jewish tradition, to have our cake and eat it too. Um,
Here
if
I
we
want to
choose to
be
go that direction.
careful.
That's how I read it from an optimistic perspective.
Here I want to be careful. I mean, first of all, like I would say I'm probably a pretty like I wouldn't know if optimistic, but like happy person. Maybe that translates into optimism. It's a matter of temperament. I think a lot of activists are that way, and I'm definitely in that. And I would say I'm definitely filled with a lot of love towards the place that I live and the people who are there. And I'm in the U.S. this year, as you mentioned in the beginning, and I miss home. So I get back there every once in a while, and I was just back there 2 weeks ago to for a conference of a movement which I help run called the Faithful Left, which is a new movement in Israel, and the book was written before the movement, and I think part of the articulation of the movement is in the book, and it's growing much more than we imagined it would. And I think it has a lot more to do. Um, but um, but I don't want Israel to be like the state of Israel to be a light to the nations. I'd be happy with the democracy. Like I'm not, I don't want to view Jewish power as necessarily a moral nightmare or as some sort of fantasy. It's something that we have that might be gone tomorrow and might not be. And we need to, as individuals and as communities, work within that context to the best of our ability. So that's the only point that maybe I would articulate things a bit differently than what you suggested. It's not, and I I don't want Israel to be an extraordinary project. I want it to be a very, very ordinary project which Jews are conducting. And Jews, I think, should behave with extraordinary responsibility, but that doesn't need to translate into a state which operates by different rules. I'd be happy with just like everybody in our region, having dignity and having equality and feeling that it's a place where they can raise their children. And on the Jewish front, I'd be happy in continuing with engaging with Hashem, with God through learning and through prayer. But I don't have any fantasies about Jewish power being something different than anybody else's power. Um, I don't think that Jews specifically can use power in a different way because of I think, and I think Chazal, our sages recognize that power is power, and one sometimes needs it, and one should be hyper skeptical and hesitant from the use of it, and use only what is needed. Which is something which is very difficult to do. Definitely in a nationalist context, nationalism sort of operates the opposite of that in terms of its internal thinking, both ours and others. But I'm not, no, so I'm not interested or in creating some sort of Jewish approach to power, which will somehow bypass how human beings usually abuse the power they have. I don't, it's not a project. That's not a project that I'm interested
Are you interested in the project? I mean, it seemed to me, well, that's a political question. This is really a theological. I was gonna ask you about the project of equalizing power in Israel-Palestine, but that's not really what the book is about. It's a
No, I mean, but I will say, I mean, for me, most of my day-to-day work is work with Palestinians. So it's definitely at that point, and one of the chapters in the book, and there's a question here if the conversation was conducted in Hebrew, mostly a bit in Arabic, but mostly in Hebrew. A lot of my sort of activist circle are not Jewish or Palestinians, be they 48 Palestinians or 67 Palestinians, and obviously and that's present in the book, and that's obviously present in the way that I approach the state. So for me, my understanding is that currently the greater land of Israel, the greater land of Palestine, from the river to the sea, is a binational. There's a binational context. There are two nations living there, calling it home. And the question is, if one sees that as something which is a problem, or something which is a beautiful thing. And I see it as a beautiful thing. I don't see like two states or something like that as a compromise. I see that as an opportunity to allow people to live in dignity. So in that sense, there's definitely like an equalizing element of this. And I definitely think that approach to is the land of Israel not from a position of ownership, but a position of love through exile allows for that language to maybe deepen in a way that talking about Israel from a perspective of ownership, perhaps less. Yeah, and here again, I'm referring to sort of the work that people like Amnon Reskarkotskin have done on this issue. And I think there are definitely a lot of models that view the land of Israel, not from a perspective of ownership, but rather from a perspective of a place where we can engage with these issues.
Wow, that's really powerful. Thank you. Before I let you go, it's 8 o'clock, but you promised to stay a couple extra minutes. So if I may, that was really beautiful. I almost want to end now just because that was such a beautiful comment. But I want to ask you, you've been in Harvard for the year, and I am sure there are listeners who want to know what it's been like for you as an Israeli at Harvard, what it's been like to be away from Israel, first on October 7th and the immediate aftermath, and then in the aftermath of the ongoing war in Gaza and everything that's happening in the West Bank, what it's been like for you having to be in America for that year. And I know you're
Um,
back, and I know you just went back for the conference, but if you could speak to it for just a
so
minute.
I'll give maybe three answers, which will also sort of give sort of maybe closure to a lot of the issues which came up. On a personal level and a family level, it's incredibly difficult not being at home. Um, like a lot of other Israelis, we have a family that's affected. I have a friend from Breaking the Silence who was killed on the 7th of October. We have a friend whose son is being held hostage. Um, the frustration of not sometimes looking at a problem is more difficult than being in the problem, and it's been very gut-wrenching to be outside. So while we're happy for our sort of like immediate safety, it's very difficult not being with our world. Um, on a being a Jew, being at Harvard level, I want to say with tremendous respect to a lot of other people everybody's going through their own experiences. I walk around with a relatively large kippah. I don't, I haven't experienced close to anything. So on a personal level, I haven't been subject to anything other than incredible amount of sort of hospitality and kindness, and understanding. So I'm aware that there are issues happening, and I want to speak with respect towards people who are going through different things. To the best of my understanding, less at Harvard, ironically, more in other places. But I haven't really experienced any of that, so it's hard for me to speak. I feel here um, not uncomfortable. Um, and maybe lastly, I would say that it's been really an interesting engagement for me with American Jews, which is something that I've obviously done in the past, but not something which I've had the opportunity to do so intensively. It strikes me as a really potentially important and beautiful phenomenon. I know it's a common sort of thing that people are worried about like the young. And in the Israeli context, in the American context, people are always worried about the college kids. But like, I think the fact that there are a lot of Jewish kids who are really frustrated, I think many times justifiably, with Israeli government behavior, and use that as a pivot to try to get re-engaged with Jewish tradition, which I'm encountering everywhere I go in sort of pretty large numbers, people who want to engage Jewishly because that's their way to identify with their history, not through the state. And rather than seeing that as a threat, I think that's a beautiful and incredible opportunity. And I'm just waiting for that Torah to come out, because ultimately I think that's what we do. We look for interesting and inspiring Torah. And if it comes, I don't care if it comes from the US or from France or from South America or from Israel. I want somebody who wants to engage with Rabbeinu Tam or the Rush in like a serious way. And I'm really hopeful that a lot of that is happening here right now. So rather than seeing what's happening with young Americans and sort of like the radicalization in the left and all that as a threat, I see it as a really, really potentially important sort of piece being played in how do we construct Jewish thought in the 21st century, and I'm really looking forward to it. So I'm even optimistic about that. So yeah, so maybe that's a good tying of all those things that we talked about.
That was masterfully done, masterfully done. Thank you. And I thank you for sharing your Torah with us. And for those who are at home, again, in the chat box, I have the title of Michal's book in English translation, End of Days. It's not a long book. It's only about 100, 110 pages. So definitely something you can read on a long, now that we have the time change, we have the long Shabbat afternoon, and it's a perfect post-cholent read
Yep.
for a
It was
Saturday afternoon.
constructed that way. It was
Yeah.
constructed to fit in your tallis bag
Yeah, put it in your
and to be
tallis
read
bag, take
after
it to
lunch.
synagogue. Just don't let the rabbi see you during the sermon, opening it up. And thank you, Michael. And
Thank you. Thanks everybody for joining.
we look forward to the next conversation. And thank you all for joining tonight. Have a good night, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye bye, Michael.